Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to be looking at the book The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by Oliver Sacks. Doesn't he look pleasant on the back? Now, this is a classic book dealing with neuropsychology. Originally written in 1970, updated a number of times. This is a 1985 edition of the book, and he has postscripts at the end of the chapters, kind of updating things. And I'd heard about this book many times, and I'd never gotten around to reading it. Then I stumbled upon a copy at a thrift shop, and it's in a little rough shape. I actually had to tape the spot right there, but it was readable, and it was a book. And he wrote the book Awakenings. I've seen the film. I haven't read the book. And I'll say one thing. The man's writing style can often be lyrically beautiful. There are passages in here that are just wonderfully written. Unfortunately, I don't really agree with a lot of the positions that Good Doctor takes. His use of language is very problematic. His attitudes towards some of the clients and patients he dealt with is very problematic, in my opinion. And he seems to be very conservative and actually regressive in some instances in this book. And we start out with losses, which deal with people who have had some kind of brain injury that has caused them to lose something, their memory, their sense of body image, their ability to recognize faces, that kind of thing. And then we have excesses, people who have disorders like Tourette's. There's too much going on, or Cupid's disease, which is related to syphilis, and it is a woman who's 90 years old suddenly had this increased libido at 90, and it was in fact related to the fact that she'd had syphilis when she was 20, and while it had been cleared up, it had not been cured. So they were able to cure it, but she hadn't when she was 20. She had been a prostitute, but this onset at 70 years later was some kind of record, I guess. Then we have transports, which are altered states of mind and being for people, like a guy who suddenly had an increased sense of smell for a period of time because something happened, a woman who suddenly had flashbacks to India as she was terminally ill, and as she got further and further towards her exit, these reminiscences just overtook her until she was living in this memory of the past completely, with this little pleasant smile on her face, until she was completely oblivious to the world, and then she passed. Then we have the last chapter, which is the last section, I should say. There's a number of chapters, four chapters in there, which is the part that really got under my skin and really made this book horrible to my mind, and it is called The World of the Simple. And that is the kindest thing this doctor says, and the people in this chapter, in this section, says about people with developmental disabilities, either because they were born this way or because they had some kind of TBI. They call them idiots. They call them morons. They call them retarded repeatedly. And the most disturbing and vile term they use is defective, like a broken television. That section was also disturbing for two other reasons. One, the doctor had never dealt with people with developmental issues before, and when he was introduced to them, someone said, "Oh, they're wonderful." There was this mythology about how somehow people with these deficits, these disorders, were somehow gifted in a way. Yes, there is the savant mechanism going on in some cases, but it was almost like, oh, they're simple, so they're divine. It was this just crap. It was like noble, savage stereotype, just horrible. But he was actually shocked to discover something. And you know what he was shocked to discover something when he started working with people with developmental issues? They're human. Seriously, this guy didn't think that they were people. He thought that they were drooling lumps that sat in corners and rocked quietly, or stared at walls. Shocked to discover they have depth and interests, and you can interact with them so long as you work within the parameters of what issues they have. And they can express themselves in different ways, even if it isn't verbal. I'll get to the most horrible part of this book in a moment. But when he was dealing with the losses section, people who, for example, had severe memory loss, one guy who was stuck in 1945. It was 1985, but he was stuck in 1945. And he would sometimes occasionally realize that something's not right. Especially when he looked in the mirror, he's old, but he's not. His brain is telling him he's 20 or 22 or something like that. So his brain is trying to process this, but it always failed because a few minutes later he would just slip back into 1945. And eventually he was able to find some solace within the home, and he became acclimatized to it, and eventually the routines kind of seeped their way into him. Even though he still thought it was 1945, he was able to maneuver around and function in this place. But he couldn't get out into the real world and function. And they get another guy in here. He had memory problems, severe ones, like the first person I just mentioned. So basically, every few minutes, his world would drop away. He would just become absolutely lost. And his response was to weave a new world. So he would see people and start to interact with them and give them new names and new roles for himself and for them, create this elaborate fantasy, this fiction. And then a few minutes later, the world would drop away, and he'd do it again with all new casts and characters. Again and again and again. Forever. The only time he seemed to ever be at peace with them when there were no people around to trigger him. When he was in the garden outside. To me, that kind of sounds like hell. But the most disturbing thing in here is the Sarah twins. And the twins had some severe developmental issues, physiologically and mentally. And they had this trick they could do where they could pick the date of any. You pick a day and they'll tell you what day it was. February 5th, 3085. And they'll tell you what day of the week is. And they'll always be right. And they went on radio and television. They were exploited, essentially. But eventually they ended up in his clinic. Right? It was a Catholic hospital. And one of the things that bugged me is he let his religion inject itself into his treating these people. He actually asked if the people who had the severe memory losses, do they have souls? That's not your job to ask if they have souls. You're a neuropsychologist. Your job is to help them survive and function in the world as best you can, and let them worry about whether they have souls. He let his religion interject itself in places it didn't belong. But back to the twins. Eventually he discovered that the twins were playing number games with each other. One twin would sit there quietly, and then he would say a 6-digit number. The other would ponder for a moment, nod his head, smile, and then he would say something. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the doctor wrote these numbers down and checked them, and they were all primes. 6-digit primes. Now this is interesting because neither of these twins could do math. They could barely function with addition and subtraction, and the concepts of multiplication and division were beyond them. And yet they were dealing with 6-digit primes correctly every day. Then one day he introduced them to 8-digit primes, and they both stopped dead in their tracks. They looked at him, they looked at each other. There was a long pause, and then they both smiled, and suddenly they had 8-digit primes in their world. He eventually introduced them to 10-digit primes. And they're processing these things. He dropped some matches on the floor one day, and both of them glanced down and at the same time said 111. And they were right. They didn't have time to count these things. They saw the number of matches on the ground. And one of the things I found interesting is he didn't seem to understand that they could have been experiencing kinesthesia. Experiencing numbers as sounds, or numbers as colors, or numbers as flavors, or smells. So those numbers could have been more than just numerals in a string. How a doctor of this caliber and training didn't think of that, I'm not quite sure. In 1985, I believe that the particular disorder was, or new way of thinking, it's not really a disorder, a new way of thinking and seeing the world was aware. I believe I was aware it existed back then. I'm sure, I was starting kind of hoping he did. But eventually someone else in this institution, it wasn't this doctor thankfully, decided that for their best interest, you can probably see where this is going, the twins were split up. They were given menial jobs outside the the facility. They were trained how to take the trolley to work and back on their own. And their mathematical language disappeared. So these two men who'd only known each other since birth, who had this beautiful, artistic language of numbers that brought them joy and entertainment, because someone felt that they had to fit in and pretend to be something that they couldn't be, part of the capitalist machine, pantomiming it, because they could never take care of themselves, they could never earn a full living. They didn't need that. They needed each other. They needed each other. And the institution took that away from them. I remember reading this chapter, and as soon as they started talking about the twins, I thought to myself, when one of these twins dies, it is going to be heartbreaking. Well, the heartbreak happened while they were still alive. And it made me so angry. So, I cannot recommend this book. It's far too problematic. The doctor interjects himself in ways he shouldn't have. I don't think he made diagnosis. He made a diagnosis of autism for a kid in here who had a TBI. He wasn't autistic. He had an actual, something happened to him that killed part of his brain at 8. It didn't just creep up on him. He wasn't born this way. But he diagnosed him as being autistic. I was dumbfounded by that. Now, there is a book out there I will recommend that deals with the same subject, and that is Phantoms of the Brain. Read that one. Don't read this. Yes, it's a classic, and yes, there is a guy in here who literally mistook his wife's head for a hat because he was face blindness. But it's got a clever title and not much else, and I didn't like it, even if it was beautifully written. So yeah, don't read it.